Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're tackling a topic that's been generating a ton of buzz online. The Queen Cleopatra docudrama and all the controversy swirling around it. I gotta say, the YouTube videos you sent over, people are really fired up about this one.
Yeah, it seems like this one's really touched a nerve with a lot of folk. And what's interesting to me is how it goes beyond the typical historical debate. We're seeing conversations about representation, about cultural ownership, even what it means to make a historical documentary in this day and age.
It's a whole mix, isn't it? We've got everything. YouTubers praising it, others absolutely slamming it, claims of historical inaccuracies, accusations of political agendas, even lawsuits.
Definitely a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it looks like you set this one over because you want to get to the bottom of what's really going on, huh?
Exactly. I think it's important to look beyond the clickbait headlines and try to understand the different perspectives at play here.
Okay, so where do we even begin with this one? It seems like the core of it all really comes down to Cleopatra's race.
You're right. That's the question that's fueling a lot of the debate.
A lot of the YouTubers are zeroing in on Netflix's decision to portray Cleopatra as a black woman, despite her Macedonian Greek heritage, which is pretty well documented.
And this is where understanding the historical context becomes really important. A lot of the folk criticizing the show point to a lot of evidence.
Like what kind of evidence?
Statues, coins, artwork from that time period. They all seem to point to Cleopatra having a lighter complexion, which would be consistent with her Greek ancestry.
Makes sense. I remember one YouTuber even brought up that first century portrait of Cleopatra from Herculaneum.
Right. And all these different sources seem to paint a fairly consistent picture of what she might have looked like.
So what did the show's creators have to say about all this? And to be aware of all this evidence pointing in another direction.
Well, they do address it. They basically argue that we can't be absolutely certain about Cleopatra's appearance. We don't have, like, a photograph, right? So they're suggesting that there's room for interpretation. Everyone is free to imagine her as they see fit.
Okay, so that's their stance. But then, on the flip side, you have these personal beliefs that people hold so strongly. Like one YouTuber mentioned their grandmother who she's absolutely convinced Cleopatra was black no matter what any history book says.
Right. And it's really fascinating to see how people draw on such different sources of information to form their opinions.
It is. So we have this kind of clash, what history tells us, and then these strongly held personal beliefs. Which kind of brings us back to the question you posed at the beginning. Is this just a reinterpretation of history? Or is it something more like revisionism?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? And this isn't just an online debate anymore either. It's gotten much bigger than that.
How so?
Well, the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities, they've come out and officially called the show a falsification of history.
Whoa, okay, so this is serious business.
It is. There's even a lawsuit in the works as we speak.
No way, over a Netflix show.
Yep. And this is where that whole issue of cultural ownership comes into play. You can see why Egyptians feel like their history is being rewritten without their consent, especially when the people creating the show aren't even from Egypt.
Yeah, it's like who gets to tell whose story? Right? I mean, one YouTuber was so fired up about this whole thing, they were calling the Egyptian lawyer taking on Netflix Caesar Augustus Mahmoud Alpha Chad Magnus, like straight out of a Gladiator movie.
You can see how much this resonates with people. It's about having control over your own history and who gets to shape the narrative.
So how are the show's creators responding to all this? What are they saying in their own defense?
Well, one YouTuber I saw quoted the director asking a pretty pointed question. Why shouldn't Cleopatra be black?
Interesting. Challenging the assumption right there.
Right. And they also challenge the whole idea that a historical figure's value or importance is somehow tied to how close they are to being white.
So they're really trying to flip the script on this whole debate.
Yeah, it's not so much about directly addressing the evidence for Cleopatra's Greek heritage. It's more about questioning the entire framework through which these accusations are being made.
Okay, that's a pretty bold move.
Definitely. They're framing the pushback within the context of colorism and even internalized white supremacy. They're suggesting that those forces are driving the backlash against the show.
Powerful stuff. But I guess not everyone's convinced by that argument. I mean, one YouTuber I saw was pretty critical of the director for comparing this to old Hollywood movies.
Oh, yeah, like the one with Elizabeth Taylor as Cleopatra?
Exactly. They were saying it's kind of minimizing to just dismiss concerns about historical accuracy by comparing it to a fictionalized portrayal.
It's true. There's a big difference between a purely fictional story and a docudrama that claims to be presenting actual facts.
Right. It blurs the line a bit, doesn't it? Makes it harder for the viewer to know what to trust. And then on top of all of this, we have another layer of controversy that keeps popping up in these YouTube videos, the whole woke agenda thing.
Yeah, that word gets thrown around a lot. Several YouTubers are using it to suggest the show is pushing a specific political agenda, and it's often linked to this idea of Afrocentrism.
Afrocentrism, what's that all about?
So to understand that critique, we need to understand what they mean by Afrocentrism. It's basically a perspective that centers the contributions of African people to world history, often challenging those traditional Eurocentric views.
So in this case, are they accusing the show of intentionally rewriting history to emphasize Black narratives above all else?
Yeah, that's the gist of it. And it's part of a bigger conversation that's been happening around various historical figures and events. That line between reinterpreting history and outright distorting it.
Right. Where do you draw the line?
Exactly. One YouTuber even went as far as saying Queen Cleopatra is part of a larger pattern of revising European history to fit a specific worldview. They even brought up the woman king as another example. It seems like there's a real concern about who controls the narrative, who gets to tell the story, and how history might be manipulated to serve modern political goals.
Yeah, a lot to think about there. It's not just about Cleopatra anymore, is it?
Definitely not. It's tapping into much deeper anxieties about representation, cultural ownership, even the way we do historical research and how that research gets presented to the public.
Okay, so we've laid out the battlefield here. This controversy really seems to be about a lot more than just the historical accuracy of one Netflix docudrama.
It really does. And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating, don't you think? We're not just looking at Cleopatra's life, we're looking at how those facts are interpreted, debated, and ultimately how they shape our understanding of the past.
Definitely a lot more to explore here. Welcome back to our deep dive into the whole Queen Cleopatra situation. So last time, we kind of set the stage, right? Laid out all the different arguments, all those accusations flying back and forth.
Exactly. We talked about the historical inaccuracies people are pointing out, all the debate around how Cleopatra is being portrayed, and even those concerns about the experts they chose for the show.
Right. A lot of different threads to untangle here.
Definitely. So now I think it's time to really get into the nitty-gritty. Put on our historian hats and look at the evidence.
Sounds good to me. Let's do it. So what are we looking at here? What are the sources actually telling us about Cleopatra's heritage?
Well, when you look at the YouTubers who are criticizing the show, they all pretty much point to the same types of sources.
Okay, like what?
Ancient coins, sculptures, those kinds of things. Even that first century portrait from Herculaneum we talked about earlier.
Right, right.
And they say these all consistently show Cleopatra with features that are more in line with her Macedonian Greek background.
So they're saying the visuals don't match up.
Exactly. One YouTuber even did a side-by-side comparison showing those historical images next to the actress who plays Cleopatra in the docudrama.
And what? It's like a totally different look.
Pretty much. You can see the visual contrast right there. It kind of highlights that disconnect the critics are talking about between what we see in the historical record and how she's portrayed in the show.
Makes sense. But didn't the show's creators say something about how we can't really be sure what Cleopatra looked like?
Yeah, they do make that point. They argue that just because we have these depictions, we can't automatically assume they're completely accurate.
I guess that's fair.
They could have been influenced by biases, right? Maybe even agendas that were at play back then when those images were being created.
True, true. I mean, we always have to be aware of potential biases in any historical source, right? But is that enough to completely dismiss all those depictions, especially when there's so many of them, and they all seem to be saying the same thing?
It's a tricky question, isn't it? And then you have some YouTubers bringing genetics into the mix.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah. One video even mentioned a study done at Cambridge. They looked at ancient DNA, and it suggested that ancient Egyptians were actually more closely related to people in the Middle East than they were to sub-Saharan Africans.
So that kind of throws a wrench in the whole Afrocentric view, right? The idea that ancient Egyptians were primarily Black.
It does make things a bit more complicated. So when you take all of that together, the historical depictions, this genetic evidence, and what we know about Cleopatra's family history, it seems like there's a pretty strong argument to be made that she wasn't a Black woman.
Okay, that does seem to be where the evidence points.
Yeah.
But like we discussed earlier, the show's creators and some of the people who support it, they're saying there's still room for interpretation. They emphasize that our understanding of history is always evolving.
Right, and I think that's important to keep in mind. We can never be 100% certain about the past, especially when you're dealing with people who lived thousands of years ago.
It's not like math, is it?
Nope, not at all. History is messy. And for a lot of those YouTubers you sent over, the problem with Queen Cleopatra isn't just about interpreting history differently. They see it as intentionally distorting the fact, maybe even pushing a particular agenda.
Yeah, I noticed a lot of the videos use some pretty strong language to describe the show. Woke, revisionist history, even propaganda. Like they're saying the creators are putting a political message ahead of historical accuracy.
And some even draw parallels to other movies that have come out recently, like The Woman King, which had some similar criticisms leveled at it. They're seeing this as a kind of pattern, this rewriting of history to fit a modern narrative.
Which I guess is something that's always been happening, right? People using history to support their own agendas. But in this digital age, with social media and everything, feels like it's become even more, I don't know, intense.
Oh, absolutely. Things can spread so quickly now, and it's easy for those more nuanced perspectives to get lost in all the noise.
Right, like everyone's got an opinion and they can share it instantly with the whole world.
Exactly. And one YouTuber even went as far as saying this whole thing with Queen Cleopatra is part of a bigger movement to downplay European history and culture, to kind of erase it.
Whoa. That's a pretty big statement to make.
It is. And I think it's important to approach these kinds of claims really carefully. We don't want to make sweeping generalizations about entire groups of people, right? History is complicated.
Yeah, for sure. It's not black and white.
Right. And speaking of nuance, that kind of brings us to another big point of contention with the show, how they portray Cleopatra's personality, especially her relationships with those powerful men.
Right. We talked about that warrior queen image they're going for, presenting her as this super strong, independent leader. But a lot of the YouTubers are saying that doesn't really line up with what history tells us.
Yeah, a lot of historians agree that Cleopatra was incredibly smart, a brilliant politician and diplomat. She knew how to use her connections to get what she wanted.
And what Egypt needed, right?
Exactly. One YouTuber pointed out that she was in a really tough spot, ruling a kingdom that was under the thumb of Rome.
They were basically calling the shots.
Pretty much. So if she wanted to hold on to her power, she needed to make alliances with these powerful Roman figures, guys like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony.
And those relationships were pretty complicated, right?
Super complicated. It wasn't just a case of strong women versus weak men. It was all about political strategy, making deals, knowing how to play the game.
Sounds exhausting.
I'm sure it was. And there's even evidence suggesting there was genuine affection there, too, at times. So you can see why some people are frustrated with how the show simplifies all of that.
It's like they're taking this complex historical figure and turning her into, I don't know, a comic book character.
Yeah, kind of. And some of those YouTubers even argue that it actually does a disservice to Cleopatra's political skills. By making her this one-dimensional girl boss, they're actually reinforcing the very stereotypes they're trying to challenge.
It is kind of ironic when you put it that way. And all of this leads us to yet another layer of controversy, that debate around the show's experts.
Right, we touched on that earlier. Remember, a lot of YouTubers were questioning those experts' credentials, wondering if they really had the knowledge and experience to speak about Cleopatra and ancient Egypt with any authority.
And one YouTuber was specifically bothered by the fact that a lot of the experts were women and people of color.
Yeah, they saw that as a deliberate move to exclude certain voices, certain perspectives.
But isn't the field of history, like a lot of academic fields, historically dominated by white men? Shouldn't we be encouraging more diversity in those fields?
You're absolutely right. That's a really important goal. The question is, how do you do that while also making sure the research is solid, that the information being presented is accurate?
It's like walking a tightrope.
Exactly. And then, of course, you have those personal accusations that were made against one of the experts.
Right, that whole nepotism thing.
Yeah, one YouTuber was saying she only got her position because of her family connections, implying that she wasn't really qualified.
That's pretty serious.
It is.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to be careful about making those kinds of accusations. You need to have evidence, not just speculation.
Yeah, we don't want to throw around accusations lightly. It can really damage someone's reputation.
Absolutely. And it's also important to remember the bigger picture here. The study of ancient history, especially Egypt, has this long and complicated history. It's all tangled up with colonialism and cultural appropriation.
Right. Western scholars coming in and telling the story from their perspective.
Exactly. And the YouTubers who are critical of the show, they're arguing that Queen Cleopatra is kind of continuing that pattern, that it's silencing the voices of actual Egyptians.
That's a really important point. So it's not just about historical facts anymore, is it? It's about power. Who gets to control the narrative?
Exactly. It's about asking, who has the right to tell a culture story? And how can we make sure that history is being presented in a way that's both accurate and respectful?
Wow, we've really gotten into the weeds here, haven't we? But I think it's important to have these conversations, to really think critically about the history we're being presented.
I agree. This whole Queen Cleopatra controversy has really highlighted some of the challenges we face when trying to understand and represent the past.
It's shown us that history is more than just dates and names. It's about people, about power, about perspective.
And about those bigger questions of who gets to tell the story.
Right. Whose voices are we hearing? Whose voices are missing? Definitely a lot to think about. And we're back. For the final part of our deep dive into this whole Queen Cleopatra controversy. Hey, parts 1 and 2, we really went deep on all the different angles, all the arguments, everything. Accusations of historical inaccuracies, all the debates about Cleopatra's race and personality, and then those questions about the experts on the show.
It's a lot to take in, isn't it? And it really highlights how complex these historical debates can get.
Yeah, and honestly, one of the things that really struck me while going through all those YouTube videos you sent over was the passion.
Oh, yeah, totally.
I mean, people are fired up about this, whether they love the show or hate it. They clearly care a lot about how history is being portrayed.
It's true. You see that passion on both sides of the argument, don't you? Which is kind of a good thing, right? It shows that people are engaging with history.
For sure.
Yeah.
But it also makes me think about how easily these conversations can get so, heated and divisive, especially online.
It's the nature of the beast, isn't it? Social media and everything. People have such strong opinions, and they can share them with the whole world in an instant.
And it's easy to get caught up in all that. It's like everyone's suddenly a historian with a megaphone, and it's hard to have those nuanced conversations when things are moving so fast.
Exactly. Nuance gets lost, context gets lost, and suddenly it's just people shouting at each other.
Right, exactly. And I feel like that's what's happened a bit with this Cleopatra controversy. Those historical narratives are getting all tangled up with current events, with modern political agendas. It's messy.
Totally agree. You have people arguing that Queen Cleopatra is basically just a vehicle for a modern political message. They're saying it's less about portraying the past accurately and more about pushing a certain worldview.
Yeah, the whole woke Hollywood thing, right?
Right.
They're seeing this as part of a larger pattern of rewriting history.
Right. And then on the other side, you have people who are praising the show. They see it as this bold move, challenging those traditional whitewashed versions of history and offering a more inclusive perspective.
So it's like we're caught in the middle of this tug of war between getting the history right and representing diverse voices and perspectives.
It is. And that's the central question we need to be asking ourselves, isn't it? How do we create historical portrayals that are both accurate and inclusive?
It's tough.
Yeah.
It really is. How do we make sure we're not racing or distorting the past,
Yeah.
but at the same time, making it relevant to modern audiences?
Right. You want to engage people, you want to make them care about history, but you also can't just make stuff up. It's tricky.
I remember one YouTuber had an interesting suggestion. They said instead of trying to rewrite the stories of these big, iconic historical figures that everyone already knows, why not focus on the lesser-known stories?
Oh, yeah, I saw that one too, and I thought that was a great point.
They were saying maybe filmmakers should shine a light on those hidden figures from history. People from diverse backgrounds whose stories haven't been told as often.
And, there are so many incredible stories out there waiting to be discovered. And by focusing on those, filmmakers could have more creative freedom too.
Right, because you're not bound by the same expectations as when you're dealing with someone like Cleopatra.
Exactly. And it's a win-win. You get to tell these amazing stories that people might not know about, and you're promoting diversity and inclusivity.
It's about expanding our understanding of history instead of trying to force everyone into a box that maybe doesn't fit anymore.
I love that. And this whole controversy has also shown just how important it is to be really critical of the stuff we're seeing, especially when it comes to history.
Yeah, critical thinking skills, right.
Yeah.
A lot of those YouTubers were saying people need to really question the sources they're consuming. Think about who made the film, what their biases might be, what their motivations might be, and to do their own research too. Don't just take everything you see at face value.
It's great advice. In the age of information overload, we really have to be smart about what we're consuming, what we're believing.
Especially when it comes to something like history, which can be so easily manipulated and distorted.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways from this whole deep dive, isn't it? Historical narratives are powerful. They shape how we see the world.
It's not just about dry facts and dates. It's about the story we tell ourselves about where we came from.
And that story can have a huge impact on how we see ourselves, how we understand our place in the world. So we need to be aware of who's telling that story. What are their biases? What are they leaving out? What are they emphasizing?
Whose voices are being heard? Whose voices are being silenced? It's so important to ask those questions.
It is. And never be afraid to challenge the traditional narratives. Do your own research. Look for those different perspectives.
And remember that history is an ongoing conversation, right? It's not set in stone. Our understanding of the past is always changing as new evidence comes to light, as new voices are included in the conversation.
Exactly. This whole Queen Cleopatra thing might have been controversial, but it's given us a chance to really reflect on how we engage with history, to become more informed, more critical, more thoughtful.
Yeah, and maybe it'll even inspire some of our listeners to go out and explore those untold stories for themselves.
There are so many amazing stories out there just waiting to be discovered, stories that can enrich our understanding of the past and connect us to a broader, more diverse human experience.
Well said. That's a great place to wrap things up, I think. So thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a wild ride. And to our listeners, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep that conversation going.